Thanks again, everyone, for joining. And I hope that this webinar on biomarkers is useful. Something we are seeing across the industry right now is that clinical trials become more and more important, and consumers are looking for them. And, when making purchase decisions, retailers expect them. So the question in clinical trials kind of shifted from should we conduct a clinical study to how strong does a study need to be? And that is exactly what we are talking about today. The strength and rigor of a study is decided in the study design and the methodologies, which is part of the study design. And this is where biomarkers are coming in. Biomarkers are currently changing the game when it comes to credibility and also quality of scientific evidence and also claims substantiation. So relying solely on how participants feel, biomarkers let us measure a little bit more what is actually happening in the body. Think about stress, for example, or hormones or inflammation, or even nutrient status, metabolic signals, and also microbiome signals. And this is all objective data, that adds a completely different level of rigor to your research. And today we are going to unpack what biomarkers are, when they make sense to include in your studies, and how brands can use them strategically to elevate their clinical research. And I am joined today by two incredible guests who are at the forefront of this work. I'm here with Keisha Feng, who is a general manager at the leading organic meal kit provider Green Chef, and Kim Sukum, head of science at Tiny Health. And I'll give both the opportunity to introduce themselves to you as well. But before I do that, in case you don't know who I am, my name is Suzanne Mitschke. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Citrus Labs. Citrus Labs is the leading provider of clinical trials for consumer brands, and we work with a lot of supplements, functional foods, functional beverages, cosmetics, and also pet health products. And at the end of a clinical study, typically you get substantiated product claims. And if you're interested in conducting your own research, you can contact us at hello@citruslabs.com, and can just visit us at citruslabs.com as well. And as always, some housekeeping. If you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box of Zoom or in the chat, and we'll answer your questions at the end of this webinar. And back to Keisha and Kim. Keisha, could you quickly introduce yourself and Green Chef?
Sure. My name's Keisha Fang. So Green Chef is part of the HelloFresh family of brands. I've been at HelloFresh for 7 years now. Green Chef has been around for about 10 years. It is our premium organic healthy eating brand within the portfolio. I've had a pretty varied background, but I think in strategy and operations and consulting, but I think it's really led to a much more interesting approach to brand, product, and strategy management that has led it to Citrus Labs. So I'm pretty excited to talk about that in more detail. And for Green Chef, if you want to learn more, we're at greenchef.com or at Green Chef on Instagram.
Awesome. Thank you. And Kim, could you quickly introduce yourself and Tiny
Yes,
Health?
yes, happy to. I'm Kim Sukum. I'm the head of science at Tiny Health. I've been with Tiny Health since basically its founding. We were founded almost 5 years ago now to be a gut microbiome health test, gut and vaginal test, and really kind of from sampling all the way to report, dive into gut microbiome metrics and analyses to make it very easy for consumers and research to really dive into the gut microbiome and see exactly what kind of metrics and balances you'd expect. So I'm really excited to be talking here today about how we help partner with Citrus Labs as well as other areas to really kind of push forward clinical studies.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much, both. So I quickly turn this into a more fireside chat thing without the slide. And Keisha, from your perspective, what you're seeing also at Green Chef, what has changed most in how brands think about product credibility over the last years?
Yeah, I can comment specifically in food and meal kits.
Hmm.
So I would say the average consumer is a lot more discerning in general. So for us, we see it on the topics of food, food waste, and the environment,
Hmm.
specifically for Green Chef being a very sustainable brand. There's much more conflicting information out there. So if you think about being organic or grass-fed or cage-free, I think consumers are confused by a lot that's touted in the health space. So that's really led us, at least, in thinking about product credibility, to really stake a claim in what we stand for. So for Green Chef, that's clean eating, trust and transparency, and real food. So I've really learned that credibility needs to come from one, a real impact on customers that you can see in testimonials, for example, and then qualified third parties. And for us, you can see that in data and results from Citrus Labs as one example, and the other certifications that we have. So really, product credibility is no longer from the brand itself, right? So it has to come
Hmm.
from these pretty validated third parties. I think overall, I really see that people are questioning and sometimes distrusting organizations and existing structures a lot less. So I think it's really valuable to invest in different voices. So our different types of credibility from a customer in Texas that we had that lost a life-changing amount of weight that you can see on our Instagram post, to being certified clean by the Clean Label Project, or our biomarker results that we'll talk about later in this conversation with Citrus Labs has really brought it all together. So we need these outside voices when it comes to product credibility.
And the word credibility is a good bridge to dive into the entire biomarker topic a little bit deeper. And let me quickly just tell you a little bit more, what biomarkers are. So biomarkers are measurable biological indicators, things that are actually happening inside your body, that we can objectively track and objectively also quantify. In questionnaire outcomes, ask participants, for example, do you feel stress or has your digestion improved? But biomarkers actually show us what's physically changing and happening. For example, we can measure cortisol levels via saliva or inflammation markers via blood tests. We can measure glucose response, glucose spikes via CGMs. We can measure, hormones and hormone panels. And that's actual physiological data that doesn't rely on someone interpreting their own experience. And there are different forms of biomarkers. So there's, obviously blood work. There's also saliva samples. There are urine tests. And then there's also microbiome. And this can be, stool samples, skin samples, or even vaginal microbiome as well. And Kim will tell us more about that part in a second. And the reason why biomarkers are used more and more also in research by brands is credibility. And you can show like a real observable impact in the body with biomarkers. So with this foundation, Kim, can you tell us more about the world of microbiome? What is microbiome? What does it help brands understand when they do microbiome testing?
For sure, for sure. So microbiome testing is becoming more and more common, and I think it's really, really critical to move from brands talking about like storytelling or talking explicitly just about like symptoms and feelings and moving more into biological evidence, which is really cool about all biomarkers, and microbiome is a really big part of that. So the microbiome is all, especially let's focus on the gut specifically, but there's a lot of different kind of communities of microbes across your body. But the gut is home to trillions of bacteria, and fungi and yeast and viruses that are working together as a living organism in response to a lot of things that you do, and to help support your system with nutrients and metabolites that really help you feel better and function, all the way from mental health and your gut-brain axis to digestive health, which of course is hugely impactful, and even to how you metabolize different drugs and supplements. So it's this really live and responsive ecosystem that's living in your gut. And what we do is we measure it via its DNA to get an idea of what's happening and how it changes over time. So microbiome, unlike looking at your individual genetics, can change and can adapt and is very responsive to things like diets and supplements that are changing over time, as well as things like stress and other environmental impacts. So when we measure the microbiome, we can get a feel for where do you sit at baseline, and then even over relatively short periods over these trials, you can see how it's changed in response to different diet issues, different supplements, different intake from the environment. And what's really impactful is it's not really just showing, what bacteria are there, because what does that mean? It's showing really deep functional differences that are happening. It's showing the downstream effects that will lead to differences in physiology, differences in symptoms down the line. And sometimes it's easier to capture the microbiome shifts before you even see the long-term impacts of, say, weight loss or physiological changes or mental health changes can be captured as the microbiome starts shifting initially.
And there's so many things that we can look into in microbiome, right there. You mentioned mental health, gut-brain axis, right? You mentioned digestive health. Are there any specifics that brands should check out when thinking about microbiome, or is it really dependent on product?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of it is like what's nice about the microbiome is there's a lot of different indications and signatures you can look for. So often the very beginning of these conversations start with study design as we talk about what markers are really most impactful for what you're interested in and what your product does. And this can be what's nice is the microbiome can to some degree capture all of them, but you have to have really clear hypotheses and really clear understanding of what should be changing to really build that story of how we're looking not just at random shifts over time, the ocean moving, we're looking at actually clear patterns that are tied to really clear directional and interventional change. So usually when we talk about this too, like you can talk about taxa, you can talk about species and hundreds of
Mhm.
bacteria, but really we think about functions. We want to really bring the story from bacteria are changing to look at the functional shifts that are happening. Look at the short chain fatty acid production. Because when we think about short chain fatty acid production, we're thinking about how your gut is responding. We're thinking about leaky gut syndrome. We're thinking about how those short chain fatty acids are hitting the bloodstream and what impacts they're having across the entire body.
I really like that. And we will shift towards this, what I call a spray and pray approach,
Mhm.
a little bit later in the conversation as well. And Keisha, with Green Chef, you included biomarkers in your study. And can you talk a little bit about which biomarkers you included? And did you feel that, it had an impact in terms of study credibility?
Yes, absolutely. So the biomarkers that we were interested in had to do with heart health and healthy weight management. So we had a lot of those kind of like perspective surveys that you mentioned earlier. Those were very helpful. Specifically to the biomarkers, we talked about weight, cholesterol levels, and then I think triglycerides and within cholesterol, HDL and LDL cholesterol. So there were it was twofold goals for the clinical trial for us. One, it's how do you really define health and clean eating, right? And so the hypothesis we had was how can we really position Green Chef to be proven with very clear data to reduce the likelihood of the top most common chronic diseases in the US. And heart disease is in the top three. So that's one of the reasons why we measured cholesterol of all types as biomarkers. And obesity is the number one. So we wanted to talk about healthy weight management. So really happy to share that in terms of the results, we did have um, significantly reduced body weight at statistically significant levels. I'm happy to talk about the other like survey results later on, which was very illuminating for us. But I think that was pretty strong for us in the clinical study outcomes in terms of biomarkers. Typically, you don't really have this tied to a meal kit, but I really wanted to get a lot more scientific backing towards this lifestyle change and how easy we can make it with a set of recipes that arrives on your doorstep every week.
Yeah, especially when you think of, something like meal kits, I think it often gets packaged into convenience food, right? And convenience food
Right.
seems to be more, on the unhealthy front. But you show that you can actually have an impact specifically also on weight with food that is easy to prepare.
Correct. Yeah, I think a lot of the feedback that we've gotten is it's restaurant quality food, but you're able to stay within like choose your goals, your calorie, protein, fiber, whatever targets you have. We have solutions for all of those. A couple of the other things that we saw that were most important has to do with the lifestyle. So the
Mhm.
participants in our intervention group with Citrus Labs was found it easier to maintain healthy eating habits. And so it's that behavioral change. They consumed fewer processed and fast food meals. So if you're full of this real whole foods that Green Chef gives you, you won't really have those cravings as much. And then most importantly, that I found really interesting was around digestion and gut health. And so very specifically and scientifically, we talked a lot about bowel movements and gas and bloating after eating, and those were all significantly reduced in the perception data. So I think it's a combination for us of the scientific biomarkers, but also this behavioral change that won't really come out of a normal consumer survey, right? So how can we really talk about diet control, energy? And healthy weight management. So our study participants told us that their clothes fit better. So, do you care about that more or do you care about specific numbers on the scale? I think for Green Chef, we care much more about how you look and feel.
Mhm. This is also how you drive behavior change, right? We often think that people want to be healthy, and that is true, right? But what is the outcome of healthy? It means that you feel better, you look better, right? You have maybe even glowing skin, or what you said, clothes fit better. And one thing that I want to add also to your study is that specifically on the digestion part, we also used validated questionnaires, which is one step up from your, study-specific questionnaires because they have been validated mostly by academic institutions. So that is also like a good form of evidence for your study. And similar to Green Chef at Citrus Labs, we are seeing more brands start to incorporate biomarkers into their studies. But it's also important to do it strategically and not include markers to include markers, right? So when you think through, if you want to include biomarkers in your study, I would urge you to think about, a couple of things. So first, what do you actually want to show or prove with your study, right? Second, what level of evidence do you need for your product claims? This is something, your legal counsel also might have some opinions on. And then third, are there any trade-offs you're willing to make? And also, are you prepared that your product might not have an impact on biomarkers at all? Because that can happen. And the reality is that, biomarkers add cost and also add complexity to your study. They can also extend your study timeline. And you're also adding participant burden, which can affect, recruitment, retention. And again, there's the uncertainty that your product might not move biomarkers in a statistically significant way. And what I am seeing from the most sophisticated brands, including Green Chef, is that they are layering biomarkers strategically. Green Chef, you heard, added strategic biomarkers to their study, but for them, it also, made sense to add them. And what I am also increasingly seeing is that larger studies, with self-reported outcomes, totally acceptable. And then, these larger studies then are adding smaller cohorts that are adding biomarkers to prove, specific physiological signals, right? You can, for example, maybe you have like 300 individuals, and then on 50, you do blood work on, for example, key inflammatory markers, or you do on 50, microbiome testing, because, that is helping you to support your product positioning. And the brands who are getting it right, know that more data is not always better. And this is what I mentioned. This is what I meant when I mentioned before the spray and pray approach. How you are winning with biomarkers is by choosing the right ones that, map your product's mechanism of action correctly and also your target product claims. And obviously also being realistic about, budget and timeline. Okay, now I want to get into the practical realities that brands face when they are designing these studies. Kim, let me start with you.
Yeah.
From your perspective at Tiny Health and the work you're doing with, all of the microbiome, what are the most common mistakes you see brands make when they are adding, microbiome to their
Yeah.
studies?
Yeah. One of the most common ones we see, and this plays into a little bit what we were talking about earlier, is not thinking about it beforehand and then trying to often
Mhm.
rush to get it in. It really is something that should be planned out strategically and really thought about, like, what are we interested in seeing here and what are the really key aspects of the microbiome we're seeing to change. And going alongside that really hand in hand is picking the right technology as well. So microbiome field, I know a lot of people feel a lot of intimidation by it because there's a lot of different bacteria. It's like, do I need to be a microbiologist to really dive into this? And the answer is no, but there are definitely some easy mistakes you can make if you're looking for like the fastest, cheapest options where you only are getting basically taxa. Like for example, one thing that we've seen some brands use are 16S. 16S can be useful in some areas. So if you're looking for large community changes, that's really helpful. But if we're talking about like usually diving into biomarkers and functional changes, the 16S won't give you that. So really knowing from the get-go kind of about like what technologies you're interested in, what markers are specifically important. If you're interested in seeing how fiber is shifting your gut microbiome community, looking at 16S might not capture the depth of knowledge you need here. So really planning from the beginning, knowing like, hey, we're interested in seeing these really specific shifts. The gut microbiome community will move with that. You can talk to, again, microbiome experts to have an understanding of how that'll shift, and they'll be able to point you really specifically at, all right, here are the markers of really interest that should be having the biggest impact and are the best ones to keep an eye on over the course of your study.
So really, when you think about, designing a study, you should bake microbiome in right from the beginning.
Right from the beginning and doing it very, very thoughtfully, aligned with exactly like you mentioned, like the mechanism that we expect this to have an impact. So it's usually, if when brands come in and it's an afterthought of like, oh, microbiome's interesting too, let's tack it on, you'll often find those issues where, oh, there's a lot of noise in this data. Well, there
Mhm.
didn't necessarily have to be if it was done more thoughtfully in the very beginning.
Yeah. Often I feel like brands think that they have to do it because it gives more credibility, but then don't really know how to do it. And that's obviously not ideal.
We've also seen them, again, different studies. Mistakes is they'll get back the data and just have like, what do we even do with this? So that kind of again comes from the fact that if you don't plan out initially what things you're looking at, then microbiome data is very complex and very large. So you'll end up with really large raw data, which can do a lot for discovery and hypothesis building, but that's usually not the place for it at the end of your study when you're trying to really kind of support your hypotheses versus at the beginning when you're really trying to set it up for success.
Yeah, and Keisha, you are actually balancing, the desire of having strong, scientific evidence with the realities of, timing, and timelines and also cost. So how do you approach that trade-off?
Yeah, I think it come similar to what Kim was saying. It really came down to us being very, very clear on our claim strategy. So what did we want to
Mhm.
say? We wanted to say something about healthy weight management. We wanted to say something about cardiovascular health. And I think an important follow-up to that is being able to test and iterate quickly to see what resonates, right? So I think I really like, Suzanne, that you brought up sometimes things don't work out in the way that you plan because actually our cholesterol biomarkers did not have a statistically significant result. I think it's for a few different reasons, how the study was structured, which subset of meals we chose to send to customers. And so that did not perform for us. However, when it came to healthy weight management, we put out like a lot of different approaches to that. And so, in terms of balancing cost and execution, take phased approaches. So, we tested out how the results of this study performed with our customers. Did it resonate with them? Did it tell them a different story that we weren't able to tell them ourselves? And we could pivot during different time frames in the year. So we have high seasons in January and in September, for example, and pivoting with different customer targets. And so the ability to be agile really helped versus an approach where you anchor an entire campaign on the outcome of this one clinical trial, and way too risky in my opinion. So, as a result, I think one interesting thing I want to point out is yes, it has to do with the results of the study, but we've also added a dedicated page on our website to the clinical trial itself. And we've been able to bring twice as many new customers to the site with our general stronger positioning in the market. So we had several contributors to that 2x growth, but one big contributor was the study. So yes, the results matter, but even the fact that we did a clinical study with Citrus Labs was a big needle mover for us. And so I think it's being really clear on what you want out of it and how you're going to use it, testing and iterating really quickly so that if something doesn't work in a certain time frame or customer target, try it in a few different ways, and really being flexible with how you communicate. Right. So it's not just the results, it's not just the scientific results, it's those survey results and the fact that we partnered in the first place.
Yeah, and communication is really important. I'm seeing it a lot that, brands are not properly communicating their clinical trials. Some are not even communicating their clinical trial at all. And what Keisha, what you mentioned, right? You communicated your results, but you also communicated that you did a study,
Yes.
which seems to be the easiest part. But I think for many, that is also the hardest part to do. Um, Obviously strong data matters, but only if you communicate it clearly and only if you communicate that you actually did a clinical study. And you can run the most rigorous study in the world and collect, incredible data and see fantastic changes. But if you cannot translate this into product claims or even into marketing language overall, then you haven't really maximized the value of your investment in that clinical study. And, this is where I believe biomarkers also introduce obviously opportunity, but also risks. Because on the one hand, you get more credibility and, more defensible claims. You're not just saying, for example, supports digestive discomfort, but now you could potentially talk about, what you've measured, microbiome composition, for example. But you also need to understand the boundaries of FDA and FTC scrutiny as well, when it comes to product claims and also when it comes to, marketing around a clinical study overall. And of course, also consumers should also understand what you did there with that study. And Kim, microbiome data, we already talked about it, is notoriously complex. You're dealing with alpha diversity, beta diversity, different bacterial strains, much, much more that I don't personally also not understand. And you were seeing brands translate that into sometimes complex marketing language. So how can a brand create out of this complex data some very clear product claims that consumers can also understand?
Yeah, yeah, no, I totally agree. I think there is often a like barrier here when you talk about the microbiome because of its inherent complexity and because of people feeling that they need to become microbiologists or microbiome experts to even wade into it. And I think the really big key here is that like the knowing your audience and then how to present things to them. So, example, if you go to a scientific concert or a scientific conference, something around then, there you can geek out all day about the different bacteria you find and really kind of dive into a lot of nitty-gritty. But for a lot of brands, their interest is on outcomes and mechanisms and not really the raw science. The goal here isn't to talk about like spend days talk about species. It's really to talk about what are the main mechanisms and outcomes that are happening here. So moving further away from just species names and kind of things that get very bogged down and technical and talking at a high level, what is the digestive tract supposed to be doing? What did the bacteria do
Hmm.
here? And how do we see really clear functional shifts that are associated with this product and associated with, using this product over a particular term? And I think that becomes much more powerful in groups who are interested in better understanding, well, what is this doing for me? Well, let's talk about what mechanistically is happening on a really kind of straightforward, functional, outcome-focused manner. And then what is important there is then there's a lot of already literature that ties in these different functional changes with other health issues, which you don't like have to connect, but you're talking about like what are the function, why are these functional changes important? There's a lot of already validated literature there. You don't have to make the claim that these functions are important. You're structuring yours around how the mechanisms are shifting from your product specifically.
Yeah, and for 2026 as well, right? Expectations, I think, around evidence, quality of research, are increasing in the clinical trial arena, for consumer brands as well. And that's true for every category where brands are making health or even performance claims. And Keisha, what advice would you give brands trying to future-proof their research?
Yeah, I think that one, it's really about staying approachable. So I think in Kim's space, it is very scientific, and probably if you're going for a microbiome test, you know a lot about the space or are open to learning a lot more about the space. For us as a food and meal kit brand, we really want to stay approachable to the claim and like why it matters to them. So you don't want the customer's eyes to glaze over with too much like inaccessible terminology. Two is like staying on brand. So I think that there's a temptation to say everything or test everything when it
Hmm.
comes to clinical trials. So similar to what you were saying before, like really set what your umbrella claim is. For Green Chef, it's clean eating and trust every bite. So how can we further define clean eating, which is an unregulated term? And how do we increase trust and transparency through things like this clinical trial? And what do we want to focus on? So know what your umbrella claim is, your brand identity, your customer target, and abide by that. The customer will always tell you the direction to go. And really also invest in fully understanding the results yourself. So invest in time with the research team and the scientists at Citrus Labs to understand the study design and the results. Um, I think in terms of future proofing, it's making sure that the results of your study can be used in many different ways, different instances, and in different seasons for your brand. And that really comes down to like appropriate study design and being clear on what you want.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I also like your how you're thinking, right? Clean eating and trust every bite, that this is the core of Green Chef. And I know when we started working with you, we had some meetings around, what do you actually want out of your study, right? What were your goals? What claims do you want to make? And also, what design can actually support this in the best way. And I think this is very important to actually think through it before you actually start. All right, so to wrap this up before we go into the Q&A part, I have two quick fire questions for both of you. Um, and Kim, first to you. What do you think is one thing brands should stop doing when it comes to clinical trials?
One things they should stop doing. Um, I think I think one thing that's really, really critical, especially again, really focusing on The microbiome is like Keisha mentioned this a little bit too. You want to have a clear story, you want to have a straightforward story, and you don't need to overcomplicate it. So even with microbiome, like we're not talking about a huge microbiology lesson. You want to have the results, you want to have the goals feel very grounded, very realistic, and not overwhelming. And that really even starts from the get-go. If you have a million markers and a lot of different directions you're going from even in study design, that carries off even as the results are coming in, that there's not clear direction, that there's not a clear story. So even keeping the story straight from your head in the study design all the way through the process really helps clarify and add groundedness, which I think the consumers can really feel in the messaging.
I like that, yeah. And I think there can be, specifically for consumers, there can be an over explanation of scientific data. There's only so much that your layman consumer can actually comprehend. And Keisha, your take on what should brands do if they want to stay credible?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, most importantly, if you want to stay credible, have that credible product. Like have your brand be credible. I think it's do the work to be able to stand for what your brand represents, whatever that may be. So, for example, we created a prohibited ingredient list and we audited every one of our tens of thousands of SKUs against that list. We created nutrition guardrails and we update it quarterly with our registered dietitians and nutritionists. So we really invest in that time and we have validations. We have organic certification, gluten-free certification, and now we have, clinically proven results. And so get behind a credible product and you can really stay credible.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Keisha and Kim, for your time and your insights today. I also want to give our audience the opportunity to ask some questions as well. Again, you can use the Q&A box or the chat on Zoom for that. And our very own marketing manager, Ben, will also help a little bit to navigate these questions. Ben, should we start with a question for Keisha?
Yeah, let's
Think
do it.
there's one.
Yeah, specifically for you, Keisha. You mentioned your study, and this one kind of revolved around if you're setting out to measure cholesterol and then don't present the results because you didn't get the right ones that you wanted. In your opinion, does that damage the trust rather than build it with consumers and the study itself?
No, I don't think so because I think we talked a lot in this conversation about being really clear about how you wanted to set up the study and about the balance between, cost and impact. So originally, we really wanted to do two studies. We wanted to do one focused on healthy weight management and one focused on cholesterol and heart health. Budget-wise, because this was the first time we were doing a clinical study, we had some budget limitations, and so we had to combine them. The thing that we felt more strongly about in terms of marketing claims was healthy weight management. So we chose recipes to be included in the study that had a much higher chance of success there. And we're like, let's see how the cholesterol performs for these. And there wasn't any statistically significant improvement, but I mean, there wasn't any degradation either. So I would say, no, if we think that heart health and cardiovascular disease and prevention is a very strong direction we want to go, I would do another clinical trial, very focused and structured towards that. So, short answer, no, I'm not discouraged by the results. I acknowledge it has to do with how the study was constructed. So I'd say that was probably a quick and dirty test towards cholesterol impact, packaged into maybe a more of a healthy weight management study.
I also want to add that just because something is not statistically significant doesn't mean that it didn't move at all. Um, so, when you look at statistically significant results, right, you can overpower a study and can make any result statistically significant, but that doesn't mean that it's clinically meaningful. Um, so it really, comes down to design and what your primary goal was. And I think for Green Chef also primary goal was weight. And there's another question for you, Keisha. Um, around what were your thoughts on understanding also metrics beyond weight, like body fat or muscle mass or visceral fat? Was that ever on the table for you to include?
Yes, absolutely. I think Citrus Ops has smart scales as well that have the
Yep.
ability to measure in that direction. I think we were really interested in that, and we collected some initial data. This goes back to the point I made on testing and iterating. And so we felt pretty strongly about healthy weight management. We put it out with our customers. I think that the fact that we did the trial really amplified our trust and credibility towards the brand and brought people to the website. However, our target customers were honestly less concerned with actual healthy weight management and a lot more concerned with meeting specific nutritional and dietary
Mhm.
restrictions, needs and allergies, right? Not to say that the number one performer. And so I think if weight management was the number one performer, we would have invested further in this direction. So that's where I really advise everyone thinking about a clinical trial. Like it doesn't have to be this big, scary be all end all. We do one to rule them all. It's
Mhm.
start with these steps and see how your customers respond, and then have them lead you in what direction to go deeper.
Yeah, it also comes down to what Kim said earlier, right? You should have a hypothesis and then create your study and your study design around your hypothesis. And obviously, you can always add more to a study, but that that really increases the risk that you are actually diluting your study results if you have too many markers and too many endpoints, because there is a thing like you are trying to just achieve too many things, and this is exactly what I mean when I talk about a spray and pray approach, right? You do not have just one shot at a clinical study, right? You can have strategically more than one study, even on one product. All right, Ben,
Let's
which one should
see.
we do next?
Um, so yeah, maybe this one for Kim and Suzanne. For brands that are earlier in their life cycle journey, what type of or what is the minimum level of biomarker rigor that still can move credibility forward with their study?
Yeah, yeah. I think I can speak a little bit of this to the microbiome, and I think we have different levels when we think of studies as they're starting out, especially early in the life cycle. We think of things more frequently as pilots, right? What do we, especially, we talked previously, like the spray and pray approach doesn't work well but what happens when you really don't know what markers you're going to see shifting and what best are you targeting? Often a good suggestion here is start with something small then. Start with something that's like you can get an idea of what biomarkers are shifting. The gut microbiome is very complex. If we start with a pilot, a small number, and see some really impactful areas, then you can always scale up and have larger studies further on and use that pilot data to really structure your next study in a very smart and solid way. So even so when you're not sure and when it could be anything, start small, build bigger.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And we're actually doing three pilots right now for one of our clients who wanted to include three very specific things in their bigger randomized control study with over 300 individuals. But we actually, steered them toward doing three small pilots with just 10, 15 individuals in it to see if there's actually a trend before they are then investing, a lot of money into a big RCT without knowing if it actually moves the needle. So starting with a pilot, I think is very clever. And many pilots also include microbiome testing or other biomarkers as well. Obviously, we are not looking for statistically significant results because these studies are, underpowered, but we are looking for trends. And when there's a trend, then we can be confident going into a big study that is adequately powered and then hopefully, achieve statistically significant results.
And I think kind of related
Awesome.
to this one is
Oh,
also the question around like timing, like how long do you need?
Mhm.
I think this is very specific to what particular product you're on. With the gut microbiome, there's some really big benefits at looking at microbiome because it can change relatively rapidly. Again, we were talking about the biomarkers that Keisha was using. Some of those take much longer to influence because they're like full body measurements, right? You have to potentially have large shifts to your diet over long periods to see shifts in some metrics. The gut microbiome can be, while very stable if you're not necessarily taking interventions, can also be much more responsive to shifts. So again, kind of talking about on pilot levels too, if you start out small and get a feel for, okay, well, if we did a short study and see microbiome shifts, that's pointing us in a certain direction and the biomarkers are pointing a certain way, versus if you're doing a longer study, then you will have some other larger biomarkers that you can also say are shifting. So it really depends on what your initial hypotheses are and how you're really structuring your test to meet the goals. If you want something really big in a short time, that's usually really difficult to kind of like to get that evidence very quickly.
Yeah, agreed. And it really also comes down to product, right? So for example, if you have we're doing a lot of work with longevity products as well. So if you have an aging clock, and if you include an aging clock, you cannot see results within 3 months. It's very unlikely. So you're looking more at like 6 months, even like 12 months to actually move the needle. Similar to when you're looking at hair. For example, you need typically like 6 months in order to actually see first results. So it really depends. But I would say that the most studies on supplements, cosmetics are in the 12-week range. But it again depends on your product. And then Ben, I think there's one question for Kim.
Yeah, and kind of following up with that, Kim, this one was around what do you mean exactly by like functional outcome focus? So maybe if you could
Yeah.
hit on how do you tell if there's improvement or deterioration? What counts as an improved
Sure.
microbiome? And how do you kind of control factors that are also happening during the study that could affect the microbiome as well?
Yeah, great question. Very complex. I'll try not to speak for an hour because I know this is something I could talk all day about. So this is also comes to like the technology and how you're looking at the microbiome. If you're looking at just species and amount of species there, it ends up being something that could be very noisy, and having an exact idea of like, is this better? This moved, like, yeah, we can say that like, one particular species of bifidobacterium increased, but is that a good thing or a bad thing? What does that mean? Well, what Tiny Health really does is takes this noise of the microbiome and puts it into really clear functional metrics. So now, rather than looking at these particular taxa, we're going to group it together and look at the particular functions that these bacteria are doing. The taxa that are doing it could be varied, and it could be a bunch of different species or different bacteria. But we're interested in the role they're playing in this ecosystem, which impacts your health. So, for example, fiber digestion is a really clear one. One of the goal of the gut bacteria is to break down fiber that you're eating. And if we are looking at those bacteria and they can't do it, then your microbiome is not functioning where it should be. So if you have a shift in a supplement that then increases, say, the fiber producing bacteria in your gut, we can measure that increase in their function, in their capacity to break down that fiber. And now you have a really clear measurement of a shift in this community that's setting them up for success and for dietary absorption of different things that they're eating. So the shift here is, again, the complicated answer is let's look at all these different bacteria and what they're doing. The realistic and hypothesis-driven one is by focusing on function. And there we're not looking then at, is everything better? Well, everything, the microbiome is kind of like a fingerprint. Everyone's is different. We can say very clearly function improved in these manner. The bacteria are better at doing fiber digestion, better at complex sugar digestion, better at short chain fatty acid productions, really key aspects in making your digestive system function, or they're not. So you have some really clear kind of null hypotheses too. These didn't shift while these did. That hopefully, I know it was a number of points there. What counts as improved? Can you control for other factors? And that's why the other factor thing is really, really why we like to start talking about microbiome from the get-go, because there are some really big influencers of the gut microbiome. And even as you're picking your population, you want to make sure you understand what those influencers are so you select correctly and so that you're not going to get some of this extra noise that's happening. For example, if someone we knows they're going to be on antibiotics soon for whatever reason, that's a big, well, antibiotics, like regardless of the impact that your product or brand is having, the antibiotics are going to overshadow that. So let's talk about our population and what we can do to really make sure that we are controlling for things that really disrupt the gut microbiome, and it's over a time span where we're really focusing on the particular shift of intervention that they're doing.
I think that
Awesome.
I think that was good. And one additional question that I think is very interesting, and Kim, you would probably agree with that. And Keisha already, mentioned that earlier a little bit. Depending on the type of brand product, do you have a recommended set of biomarkers to jumpstart a clinical trial? Is there anything in microbiome that you would recommend, or is it really just depending on product? I would assume, right, there are so many different forms also of microbiome, right? Skin microbiome, vaginal microbiome, stool microbiome. So these are all, obviously depending on product, but let's stick with stool microbiome. Is there any test that you can just say, yeah, sure, let's do this one to start with?
Yeah. Yeah, and I would like to point out too that like our gut microbiome test, like we talked about like being just over flooded with metrics. The test itself is very nice because it will give all of those metrics regardless. You're capturing the community and you're seeing a lot of different metrics. The important aspect is interpretation and being able to pick out the signal from the noise. And so that's where you really want to come in with hypotheses of like, okay, well, this is a dietary supplement that we suspect will have an impact on how the gut microbiome is functioning. Then let's look at those functions. Those are going to be the key things that we're going to really hone in on, versus like this is something that we expect has a difference in stress management and serotonin production. And then here we'd expect a very different shift in the gut microbiome. And so now we're paying attention to other really key gut microbiome markers. The nice thing, you're getting all of them from the test. But really, like again, to try to avoid some of the mistakes we're talking about previously of having too much data, of being not well powered for particular aspects of it, you really have to have an idea of, okay, we're getting everything. Here are the things we're really going to set our hypotheses around. Here's the things that we're going to really try and control and have an understanding of how we're seeing shifts and influences.
Yeah, and what Keisha mentioned earlier, right? Think about, what do you want to get out of the study? What are your goals? And then these goals lead you to biomarkers. And for some studies, biomarkers might not be appropriate, right? They are behavioral studies that don't include biomarkers because you don't need them. So, that is always a possibility as well. And it doesn't mean that your study is not rigorous. It's just the way how behavioral studies are designed. And then you would use something like validated questionnaires, um, for example. Amazing. I think we are almost at time. And thank you very much, everyone, who joined this webinar on biomarkers, and I hope you found it useful. And thank you very much to our two wonderful panelists, Keisha Feng from Green Chef and Kim Sukum from Tiny Health. Keisha, again, how can people find out more about Green Chef?
Yeah, come to our Instagram page. We have posts most days. You can get a look at what our recipes look like, what our customer testimonials are, things about Citrus Labs. It's at Green Chef. And then if you want to come try a box, it's greenchef.com. We have pretty significant discounts running right now to really help you jumpstart your year in a really strong way. So I'd encourage you all to come check that out.
Amazing. And Kim, how can people find out more about Tiny Health?
Yeah, I'd recommend checking out tinyhealth.com. And especially if you're looking for studies, check out poweredbytinyhealth.com. And it'll really walk you through our technology, how microbiome works. Again, it doesn't have to be something overly complex. I know it's a bit intimidating to some individuals, but really encourage you to kind of see the big functional connections that come out of it and really get an idea of what the microbiome can measure and look into.
Awesome. And if you want to learn more about Citrus Labs, go to citruslabs.com or send us an email at hello at citruslabs.com. And thank you very much, everyone. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.